Tame this wild stallion, and this Sutter's mill is yours, smirked the trading post owner at the Stablehand. They hung a cowbell outside Crowell's trading post to call men to foolishness. It clanged at sundown like a jury that had already decided. Cards stopped, words sharpened, horses stirred as if the sound were for them. On the porch, where the floorboards knew the weight of lies, Ezekiel Zeke Crowell planted a boot on the rail, tipped his hat to catch the last gold of the day, and let a smile tilt his mouth. "Tame this wild stallion, and this Sutter's mill is yours," he smirked, the sentence thrown across the street like a rope meant to tighten on the first neck it found. People turned, because people always turn when the promise is a thing too big for pockets. A whole mill, a creek's muscle, a wheel that could grind wheat and debt into something that feeds you back. The river that powered Sutter's mill, Sutter's Fork, railed through the gorge beyond the cottonwoods. It had been running men crazy since '49 and would keep running when their names were gone. The mill had been sleeping since winter took the last blade, and since Zeke took the courage of those who might have fixed it. Rosa Valdez stood in the dust with her hands quiet at her sides. 22, sun-browned, solid as an honest door, plus size in a valley that liked its women invisible and its horses obedient. A red kerchief was knotted at her throat. A straw hat read the wind by the way it tilted. Horsehair clung to her shirt like a signature no one else had the right to sign. She worked other people's animals for a living and saved up whispers for herself. The stallion in question stood inside the makeshift pen beside the post, a grey Tordillo that caught fire from the sun and threw it back. He wore a scar, like a crooked star on his left flank, where a spur had once been a solution. His eyes weren't wild. They were awake in a way that made cruel men itch. They had named him Comet because he came and was gone between blinks, leaving mistakes behind him in a polite order. Splintered rails, a barrel on its side, a man on his pride. Tomasito, the stable hand no taller than the thrust of Comet's shoulder, tugged Rosa's sleeve. "Don't let him," he whispered, and they both knew he meant Zeke more than the horse. Zeke spread his arms so his coat could think it was a cape. "The terms are simple. You, Rosa Valdez, the town's little horsewitch, will mount that grey from inside the pen, ride him across the bridge over Sutter's Fork, ring the mill bell, and bring him back without blood. Do it before sundown this time tomorrow, and the mill, deed and water rights are yours. Fail, and I collect my due for entertaining you, your stable and everything in it." A sound went through the crowd that wasn't laughter. It was appetite apologizing for itself. Sheriff Jedhart leaned in the doorway, chewing a thin straw with the patience of a fence post. "That's a lot of ownership to sling off a porch. It's a lot of show to bring to one," Zeke returned. "You want quiet, Sheriff. Close your ears." From the schoolhouse came Lena Sutter, hair pinned to behave, dress clean the way a teacher's pay keeps it. Careful. The mill had been her father's, and after his death, the papers had learned how to hide. She looked at Zeke as if he'd dropped a book in the dirt and asked children to read it for him. "You can't wager what isn't wholly yours." "Then fetch the other half," Zeke said sweetly, "and I'll sweeten the terms." He lifted a flask and did not drink from it. He enjoyed keeping things just out of reach. "Don't bargain with a man who never pays for his own coffee," murmured old Ben Two-Feathers from the porch post. He had 60 years in his bones, and the quiet of a man who had watched more than he'd been watched. He touched the brim of his hat toward Rosa, a benediction disguised as habit. "If you take it, Nina, take it on your terms." "My terms are no spurs, no whip, no blinders," Rosa said to Zeke, voice low but aimed for the edges where boys listen. "I won't hurt him to win your toy." "It isn't a toy," Zeke said. "It's the lever that moves this town." "Then you shouldn't have let it rust," Rosa said. He laughed and gave the laugh to the men who decided they liked being given things even when the thing was just the sound of themselves. "Do we have sport or a sermon?" Rosa looked past him, not at the men, not at the porch, at Comet. She let her eyes soften the way you look at water if you want it not to run. "We have a horse," she said. She stepped to the rail. "Hello, handsome." Comet blew and leaned away, not out of fear, but because courtesy demands a little distance to decide what names mean. Rosa did not climb the fence. She did not fence the horse in her gaze. She folded her hands and waited while he measured. The pen creaked when he stepped, and the sound made men tense. It made Rosa laugh under her breath. "Lena," she said without looking, "I'll need the bridge clear and the bell rope free. And I'll need the right to take tomorrow's sunrise instead of your sunset. I work a horse when the light is clean." Sheriff Hart tipped his hat. "Sunrise keeps us honest." Zeke rolled his eyes. "Sunrise, sunset, you'll fail either way." He flicked his wrist at his hired bronc-buster Colt Bannister, a man who smiled in pieces so he could dole them out like favors. "Watch that she doesn't use magic. Good gentling looks like magic when a man only knows beating," old Ben said toward the sky. Colt's smile held. "We all speak different languages, Elder. Mine's rope." "Mine's breath," Rosa answered, still not taking her eyes off the grey. Zeke slapped the post as if to call a curtain. "Terms are set. Sutter's mill to Rosa Valdez if she rides this demon across the creek and rings the bell before the next sundown. If she fails, my men empty her stable and she works off her debt, sweeping my porch until it's a mirror." He looked pleased with his metaphor, which meant he'd only just thought of it. "Bram, you'll witness." The sheriff didn't move. "I'll witness by daylight, with 3 townsfolk who aren't on anybody's payroll. No tricks after dark." "Afraid of the dark, Sheriff?" Zeke asked. "Afraid of men who need it," Hart said, and the porch remembered to respect a man who doesn't raise his voice unless he's stopping a bullet. The cowbell clanged again because men who have found spectacle always ask for seconds. The crowd drifted toward the pen like heat-seeking shade. Comet let them watch and did not watch back. Zeke turned to Rosa. "You need a saddle, Stablehand? I've got one new in from San Francisco, never sullied by anything so humble as a working animal." "No saddle," Rosa said. "He's had too many strangers on his back already." She slipped her hat off, set it on a post, and tied her red kerchief tighter. "Tomasito, bring me a halter and a length of old lead rope." "Old?" Zeke sneered. "My, we are particular in our poverty." "New rope pulls when it doesn't give," Rosa said. "He'll think it's a snake." Tomasito ran and returned, panting, with a halter that had learned patience and a rope that had learned to forgive. Rosa took the halter but didn't lift it. She breathed once, twice, long enough to make men shift their weight, because waiting is harder than work. Old Ben spoke to the side of her face so as not to break the line she was drawing with the air. "Remember the water. He hears it before he sees it. If the sound is wrong, be the sound." Rosa's mouth tilted. "You'll be there." "I've been where I'm needed since before you were a thought," he said. "I'll be there." Lena stepped closer with a look that brews a promise and a confession. "Half of the mill is in my father's Bible with our name. The other half," she swallowed, pulled her shawl tight, "was never found when he passed." Rosa nodded without looking away from the horse. "Sutter men liked bells," she said. "They hung them on everything to make silence stay polite." Lena blinked. "The bell." "Maybe," Rosa said. Colt Bannister flicked a glance to Zeke, got a nod that looked like nothing, and sauntered to the back of the pen as if to study the lumber. A small paper twist dropped from his hand into the dust. Tomasito saw it because boys see the small squirrels while men aim for elk. He scooped it and smelled copper and something cruel. "Sanguinaria," he hissed to Rosa without moving his lips. "Kick it under," she breathed, and he did, heel grinding the powder into the earth, where it would die a small, anonymous death instead of waking in a horse's blood. "Ladies and miners," Zeke crowed, arms wide, "the town's little miracle will now show us how to kiss a thundercloud." Rosa didn't answer him. She stepped sideways into the pen, halter loose over one wrist, rope coiled in a hand that would never yank. Her shoulders rounded in a shape that told the horse, "I am not a mountain falling. I am grass." She stayed off his eye. When he shifted, she shifted and did not chase. When he breathed, she let her breath answer. In the watching, the town learned how to be quiet without calling it prayer. Comet dropped his head an inch. Rosa let the rope drop an inch. He licked as if he could taste an argument losing flavor. Rosa took one step toward his shoulder, not his face, hands low, palms soft. He sidled, not to flee, but to see. She laughed, not to charm the crowd, but because the air finally felt like doing what air should. "There you are," she murmured. At the edge of the yard, Vern Lockwood, a man the color of untrustworthy money, watched from the shadow of the Coopers. He wasn't from here. His coat said he wished he weren't anywhere. He calculated water in his head the way some men count sheep, and he counted people only insofar as they clogged his river. He was the kind of partner a man like Zeke keeps in a back pocket and denies knowing until the money is dry. Sheriff Hart caught the shape of him and filed it under later. He watched Rosa instead, not because she was pretty, she was in the way a true tool is beautiful, but because his town might hang the winter on whatever happened next. He saw her hand hover and not land, saw the stallion's nostril flare, then soften, saw the thin moment where fear considered stepping aside to make room for curiosity. Colt Bannister, bored by a miracle that wasn't loud, stepped on a stray plank so it slapped the fence. Comet came up light in the front, beautiful as a mistake a man will lie about later. Rosa stepped back, weight low, and let the front feet come down in the place she had just left, as if she had removed a stone from a boy's path while telling him a joke. "Easy," she said, and it wasn't a word, it was a direction. "You'll need spurs in the morning," Zeke murmured to no one. Old Ben heard. "She'll need a town that remembers it has hands," he said. "Spurs are for men who forgot how to use theirs." Rosa lifted the halter like a question. Comet curved his neck, not because she had caught him, but because she had offered him a shape that fit. The strap slipped over his nose, and the buckle whispered at his cheek. She didn't tighten it yet. "Not a trap," she breathed. "A promise." She let the rope touch his shoulder and fall away. Let it touch again. Let it ask. His ear tipped toward her and stayed. The men exhaled like a wind had changed inside their own chests. "Sunrise," Rosa said without looking away. "I'll bring him across Sutter's Fork when the water thinks it owns the hour. Or when my men say," Zeke said, but the sentence felt small compared to the animal starting to stand in a different shape beside the woman who had asked him to. The crowd loosened, broke into small telling, drifted toward dinner and trouble. Lena lingered. "If you win, what do you make of a mill?" "A bell you can hear all the way to winter," Rosa said. "A roof that doesn't leak when the town needs someplace to stand. I make a place where men sign their names under the sky and not in back rooms." Lena smiled like she'd been carrying a seed and now had a place to plant it. "Then win." Night came down without asking permission. Lamplight took over the edges. Colt slipped into the livery with a fuse and a plan. Tomasito, who slept light and loved horses louder than sleep, rolled off his cot, landed barefoot without noise, and stepped on Colt's shadow with his own. "You lost?" he asked, and in his voice was the kind of steel men find out they respect after they've made one mistake too many. "Go to bed," Colt said, aiming to sound like a friend of father's. "Can't," Tomasito said. "Some men don't like the dark. I have to make sure it doesn't swallow them." Colt let the fuse fall into his pocket again, changed trouble to tomorrow, and went to tell Zeke that the boy with the eyes would need removing. When the town slept as much as it ever did, the creek kept talking over rocks. Sutter's mill loomed against the moon like a rib that hadn't learned the names of the rest. Somewhere beyond, a coyote folded himself into the shape of the hillside and listened. In the pen, Comet dozed, standing, one hip soft, breath fogging the beam. Rosa sat on the fence, hat pulled down, counting the rhythm of a life that did not need her and had made room anyway. "Tomorrow," old Ben said from the dark, as if reminding time of its manners. "Tomorrow," Rosa said, and slid to the ground. Dawn would bring the bridge, the bell rope, the water, The noise, and men who like to add fear to everything that already had enough. But just before dawn, the fence learned a new sound, quick as thunder inside a pocket. Nails popped, a rail cracked. Colt banisters string and rattle, thrown from the alley, hissed like a snake under Comet's belly. The stallion reared, struck the damaged corner, and the whole square of lumber yawned open. He came out like a knight being returned to the sky. The crowd that hadn't yet gathered heard the crash, and came running. Zeke reached for his flask and found only his mouth. Sheriff Hart moved toward the gap. At the same time a man should and would. Rosa did not move toward it. She stepped inside the pen toward the center of where a horse had just not been, and stood with her hands empty. "Rosa!" Tomasito cried, because boys cry the name of the person who knows what to do. She lifted one hand, palm out to the air, as if telling the dust to wait its turn. "Let him," she said softly. "Let him see who chases." She turned to the line of men at the broken rail, to Zeke with his smirk looking for someone to live in, to Colt with his boot lifted off a guilt he might yet deny. "Nobody moves." Comet wheeled in the street, searching the edges for the thing that had hissed like cruelty. He found nothing but people trying to look like fence posts, and a woman who refused to look like anything but herself. He snorted, shook, and stopped, long enough for the town to see that wild and free aren't the same, and that the difference is whether anyone is hunting you. Rosa stepped once, twice, the way you walk into a creek you intend to wade and not cross. The halter still looped her wrist. The rope trailed like a thought you haven't finished. "Hello again," she said. "You came out." "Me too." Behind her in the trading post shadow, Zeke smiled as if he had planned dawn itself. "You heard the wager," he reminded the townspeople, soft as poison. "By tomorrow's sundown." "By sunrise," Sheriff Hart corrected, not looking away from Rosa. Old Ben stood at the corner of the street, palms turned out, as if to show the morning he wasn't carrying a single wrong thing. "Be the sound," he murmured. Rosa let the rope brush the dirt. Comet flicked an ear. Somewhere a cowbell swung itself still. The creek's roar reached down the gully and settled into the bones of the bridge. "Tomorrow," Rosa said to the horse, to the town, to the smirking man who thought ownership and custody were the same word. "We'll walk the water." Comet lowered his head, just enough to make a promise the size of a breath. And the town, which had spent so long pretending to be made of gold, felt for one heartbeat like wood and muscle and the kind of yes you say with your feet. Dawn came thin and silver, putting a soft edge on everything that had been loud the night before. Sutter's fork gossiped over stone, the mill sat grey as a sleeping ox, and the trading post's porch remembered every boot that had lied on it. Rosa Valdez was already in the yard, with her hat on her back and her sleeves up, the halter looped loose over her wrist, the way you wear a promise you mean to keep. Old Ben Two Feathers leaned on the fence rail and hummed a tune that sounded like a creek, teaching a rock patience. "Be the sound," he reminded almost to himself. "I will," Rosa said. "If the water argues, I'll speak fluent Creek." Comet watched her with one ear while pretending not to. He stood square and handsome and full of the kind of opinions you earn. The scar on his flank caught the first light and didn't apologize for anything. Rosa stepped into the pen the way a morning steps into a kitchen, quiet, with a pot already on. "Hands low," Tomasito whispered to himself from the top rail, practicing for a life he intended to have. "Eyes soft. Don't go straight at the face." Rosa didn't. She curved around Comet's shoulder like a thought taking the long way. She let the rope kiss his skin and fall away. "That a good sound?" she asked him, meaning the scrape of rope, the breath between them, her heart deciding to be slower than fear. He licked, then breathed a little bigger. She matched him, not mocking, not commanding, answering. When he shifted, she shifted and did not chase. When he stopped, she stopped and let the stillness become a thing with weight. Then she lifted the halter like a question. "May I?" He put his nose through as if he'd come to that conclusion by himself. She buckled the strap and left it slack enough to mean this is not a trap. This is a conversation. Across the yard, the cowbell hung quiet, as if it understood this wasn't its scene. Sheriff Jed Hart arrived, with 2 planks over his shoulder and a hand-painted board under his arm. He set the planks down by the gate and held up the board for the town to read, because he had painted the letters himself and wanted their respect to stick. By sunlight only. 3 witnesses. No spurs, no whips. He nailed it to the gatepost with a care that made the morning feel official. If you've got business with another person's body, you do it while the sun and your neighbors can see you, he said. If you've got business with a horse, you leave your iron at home. Zeke Crowell stood in his doorway with a cup he made look like coffee. Rules multiply when people don't know how to mind themselves, he said. Maybe, Hart said, or maybe we're just writing down what decent folks have been doing without being asked. Colt Bannister drifted near the back corner of the yard with a face like a smile trying to break parole. A little firework string slept in his pocket and made him feel clever. A fuse stuck up like the lie it was about to be. He put his boot on it, then took it off quick when he saw Tomasito's eyes on him like a dog that had learned a word men didn't think dogs could learn. "You got business, Colt?" Hart asked mildly without looking. "Just admiring the show," Colt said. "Never seen a horse taught his letters like this." "You will if you keep still," Old Ben said. "You might even learn to read your own." Rosa slipped the halter's lead through her hand. "You ready, handsome?" She didn't tug. She simply walked, slow enough to be boring and exact enough to be interesting. Boredom is where fear can take a nap, and the best horsemen let it. Comet followed as if by accident, then more on purpose. They walked circles that looked like moons around a thought. They stopped with Rosa's shoulder at his, not in front, not behind. She set her hand, where the old spur scar had become a canteen for rain, and rubbed with the heel of her palm until the skin warmed, and the muscle underneath remembered it could go from hard to useful. "That wasn't your fault," she told him, and his nostrils told her he knew. Lena Sutter arrived with her hair pinned plain, and her mouth set like someone who had found an arithmetic mistake and meant to make the room notice. She carried a coil of clean bell rope over one arm as if it were a sash at a wedding. "It was rotten," she said by way of greeting. "I spliced new. The tongue will ring if you ask properly. Then we'll be polite to it," Rosa said. "I don't shout at things I want to last." Lena's gaze travelled to the new sign on the gate. "By sunlight only," she read softly. "I like the sound of that. It's the only way to make a habit into a law," Hart said, thumbing a nail flat. Zeke's partner in quiet speculation, Vern Lockwood, wandered up like a man who'd been invited by his own importance. He looked at the planks by the gate, at the halter slack in Rosa's hand, at the way the town had arranged itself into a circle that wasn't a trap. "The creek's up," he observed, meaning it like a threat. "Water does that when snow remembers to let go," Old Ben said. "Men do too, if they've got sense." Rosa led Comet to the 2 planks Hart had brought. She set them on the ground side by side and stepped onto the first. It rocked a scrape. Comet lifted his head and brought it down again, listening with his feet. "Step," Rosa said, tapping her knuckles twice on the plank, a rhythm not far from a heartbeat. "Step." She went forward, a small, precise measure. Comet touched the wood with the toe of his hoof and took it back. Then he put it down again, fully this time, and learned the board would tell him the truth about where the ground was if he asked nicely. Children gathered like coins rolled by the same hand. Tomasito held out a tin cup and rattled a little because practice in noise beats, being surprised by it later. "Too much," Rosa said gently, and the boy rattled less until the sound became small enough for a nervous system to file without commentary. Colt blew a breath through his teeth as if to say none of this was man's work. Then he caught Hart's eye again and found something else to look at. Lena, watching from the fence, said softly, "He hears the water already." "He's supposed to," Old Ben said. "He is a creature meant for flight. Our kindness cannot be to make him deaf." Rosa led Comet to the edge of the yard and then to the road that leaned downhill toward the creek. The bridge waited, a spine of boards between two stone shoulders. Sutter's fork threw white commentary at the pilings and dared anyone to answer. Rosa stopped at the last dry dirt before the first plank and breathed 3 long, slow farm-woman breaths that would have cooled a pie on their way out. "On the ground for this part," old Ben advised. "I'm not interested in being taller than him when he decides what he believes," Rosa said. She slid her hand down the lead rope until there was just a loop plus between her and the halter, and then stepped onto the first board. The creak made a bigger sound, as if insulted that anyone would step into its sentence before it was finished. Comet blew and skittered sideways, then planted and thought. Rosa didn't look back. She tapped her knuckles twice. Step, step, and waited. From the trading post porch, Zeke's voice came oily. "Clock's running. Stablehand." Hart drove the point of his hammer into the rail post like punctuation. "By sunrise tomorrow," he reminded in the voice that kept funerals modest. "You got all day to be afraid, Zeke. Let somebody else use the morning." Rosa tapped, "Step, step," and Comet reached with his toe again, then set it and left it, the board answering with a hum that travelled up bone. He set the second foot on the second board and discovered the world did not collapse when both front feet were on a bridge. He lifted them and set them again, a little surer. "Good," Rosa said, and somewhere in the word was a little girl who had taught 4 feral kittens that hands could be bowls. She clicked her tongue, the way you do when you're counting, not when you're telling a horse anything. She stepped forward to the next board and didn't ask for more than a foot. Behind them, the town went quiet in that useful way that makes sound carry clean when you need to hear a nail protest. Old Ben tapped the rail with his fingernail. Tock, 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 and that became the metronome the nervous system likes better than bravery. Tomasito rattled the tin cup under his breath, and Lena stood by the bell rope and wrapped it twice around her palm like a woman holding lightning and chiding it into behaving. They made it 3 boards, 4. On the 5th, a log bumped the upstream face of a piling, as if to remind the conversation who had been here longer. Comet flinched. Rosa rocked back to give him room without letting him leave. "I hear it too," she said. "We don't have to agree with it. We just have to keep breathing louder than it is." On the bank, Colt shifted his foot again and would have given in to the old friend in his pocket if Hart hadn't been watching his hand instead of his face. "Hand it over," the sheriff said. "What?" "The snake you built last night," Hart answered. "I scraped it out of the alley before it could learn to speak." He held up the dead rattle of twine and washers in his other hand and let the assembled witness make up its mind about Colt Bannister. The man's smile tore and didn't find where to sew itself back on. "Enjoying your sermon?" Zeke asked Vern under his breath. "I'm enjoying how many voters are discovering they can hear," Vern said. "You might consider not talking while they do." They made it to board 6. Rosa didn't count out loud. She counted with her bones. "Good," she said again. Not for Comet, who already knew, but for herself, who needed reminding that good is sometimes microscopic. She stepped to board 7, which wobbled in a way the others hadn't. "Loose," she said. Abel Pike, the carpenter who mended things without asking for applause, spat in his hands and went under the bridge belly to belly with the creek. He shouldered the bad plank back into its brothers and wedged it with a sliver of cedar. "Go on," he called, voice steady enough to walk on. Comet placed a foot, then the other. He thought about the back feet a long time, as if negotiating with 4 different creatures inhabiting the same body. Then he brought the left, then the right, and there he was. 4 on the bridge, the creek demanding attention and not getting it. "Good," Rosa said, and let the rope drop a hair so he could choose the next part himself. He chose to smell the board, where 100 boots had written a leather alphabet, and a dozen mules had stored their opinions. He sneezed, shook his mane, and set his foot on board 8. Zeke folded his arms. "He'll spook at the bell," he predicted, for the benefit of men who like to be told what the future is so they can react to it in advance. Lena at the rope smiled without showing teeth. "He will respect volume that keeps time," she said. All creatures do. Hart watched the sun climb up the cottonwood and thought about lines you can write on wood and lines you can only write in people. He saw Zeke counting townsfolk in the reflection of his trading post window and finding the number wrong. He saw Vern already editing his sentences towards something that could pass for wisdom if you stood far away. He saw Tomasito growing into a man who would own his fear publicly and therefore own less of it. Rosa didn't mount. Not today. She knew the difference between a first step and a grandstand act. She led Comet back 2 boards and forward 2 and then off to dirt without making a meal of it. They touched the boards again from the other side because the world flips sometimes and horses notice. "Tomorrow," old Ben said, pleased with how the word felt in his mouth now. "Tomorrow morning," Hart corrected, eyes on Zeke. "Before I'm out of my bedroll," Tomasito promised, not to Rosa, but to the idea of doing something right. Rosa turned Comet in a slow circle that made him look at every part of the landscape in measured slices. Trees, faces, hats, rope, planks, water, rocks, sky, Lena's blue dress, the bell tower. "We'll go ring you," she told the bell in her head, "but only if you ask nice." Zeke sauntered down to the creek bank as if the scene were his to walk through. "What happens when he refuses at the last?" he asked loudly enough for the town to overhear. "All this theatre and no curtain." "Then we go another day," Rosa said. "The wager is yours, the work is mine." "Work without pay is a sermon," Zeke said. "Work without cruelty is a revolution," Lena returned, and the crowd liked that sentence enough to hold it for later. Afternoon leaned into heat. Rosa gave Comet water, not from a bucket shoved into his face, but from a shallow pan set where he could put 1 foot in it, if he needed convincing the world was not planning a drowning. He drank with his lips, not with his fear, and went back to chewing on the idea of planks. At the trading post, Vern Lockwood counted coins and thought about Watergates. He had a line ready for tonight, the kind men like him rehearse as they shave imaginary whiskers. Safety, order, stewardship. He would try to sell the town a plan in which the mill stayed quiet under his kindly hand. Evening came dressed as gold. Rosa walked Comet to the bridge 1 more time, touched the first 3 boards, and then stood with him on dirt, listening to the creek. She drummed her fingers on the lead in a pattern that meant nothing and everything. "Here we are, here we are, here we are." He lowered his head until his breath found her sleeve. "Tomorrow," she said into his mane. "Tomorrow," Lena echoed from the bell rope. "Tomorrow," Hart agreed, pocketing his hammer. In the open window of the trading post, Zeke's smirk found the shadow it liked best. Colt Bannister tried to piece his smile back together and discovered he didn't have all the thread he used to. Vern folded his speech in half and wondered whether the town would let him read it without changing the words. Night staked its claim. Rosa slept on the livery's threshold with her bootlaces looped around the halter, not to restrain a horse, but to be woken by the sound of intention. Tomasito slept with 1 hand on the new sign's post, as if holding it up in the dark might help it learn to hold itself in the day. Old Ben dreamed of rivers running both directions at once, and woke smiling, because sometimes the world does that when you've been good. Before dawn could finish its first sentence, fog lifted off Sutter's fork like breath. Rosa stood, brushed the hay off her back, and rolled her shoulders into a day that had work written all over it. She led Comet to the bridge in the near blue and put her boot on the first board. He stepped up with her like a friend who has decided to try liking your hobbies. Board 1, board 2, board 3. The creek argued. The boards answered. Rosa tapped her knuckles. Comet listened. On board 4, a fish leaped where the water gathered into a question mark. On board 5, a jay scolded something only jays can see. Board 6 hummed. Board 7 had Abel's cedar wedge in its cheek and held its tongue. At board 8, Rosa stopped and let the quiet pile up. On the far bank, Lena's hand was already in the rope. Hart stood in the road, breathing in time with the horse, because a sheriff can learn something from a boy and a woman and a creek. "Ready?" Rosa whispered, not looking back. Comet stretched his neck, searching in the air for a smell that would make this simpler. He found only wood and river, and the sweat of a woman who had decided he was not a problem to be solved, but a creature to be talked into crossing. He put his right forefoot on board 9. The board spoke. The creek sang. The bell on the hill, though no one had touched its rope, picked up the idea and held it. They were halfway, and the town, which had come to the edge of its own bad habits, leaned forward without moving. It learns, someone thought. We do too. They met the morning where it had left them. On board 9, with the water talking too loud, on the edge between what a horse believes and what a person insists. Rosa did not insist. She stood as if boards had grown out of the soles of her boots, knuckles tapping a soft 2-beat the creek couldn't drown. Comet touched board 10 with the toe of his hoof and took it back, then put it down again like a man laying a card he wants to believe will change the evening. Good, Rosa said, not sweet, not proud, just accurate. She let the rope slide until it was only the curve of a question between them. We'll stop if the wind says so. The wind did not say so. A breeze moved the cottonwood leaves into a tired applause. On the far bank, Lena Sutter held the bell rope like a teacher with a pointer, meant for emphasis, not punishment. Sheriff Hart stood with his thumbs in his belt and breathed through his nose in the rhythm Rosa had set. Old Ben Two Feathers hummed the creek back to itself. A jay scolded, then took its opinions aside. Abel Pike, still under the bridge with cedar wedges and the steady of men who don't need their names, said aloud, tapped once on a rib to tell Rosa where the wood would hold its breath without breaking. She stepped to board 11. Comet came. Board 12 spoke. The town didn't dare. Zeke Crowell watched from the trading post window where smirks go to breed. Vern Lockwood stood beside him with a ledger closed under his arm like a sleeping snake. If she pulls this off, Vern said in the voice he used to price things not for sale, the mill becomes a community lung, harder to privatize breath. Zeke swallowed something that tasted like patience boiled too long. Then drown the lung, he said. Logs, noon, a spill the bridge can't ignore. Vern didn't blink. You flood the town on a dare, you'll be steward of a ghost. We need a reason that looks like safety. Then write one. Zeke adjusted the cup in his hand until it looked like coffee again. You're good at writing. Rosa was not in the window or the ledger. She was on board 13, then 14, then 15. Comet blew hard enough to put steam on the day. She listened for the change in tone the planks make when they mean to argue and found none. We could, she said under her breath, which is a sentence people who don't need to prove themselves are allowed to say. From the bank, Tomasito lifted a tin cup and gave it the smallest rattle, then quieter, then just enough to remind a nervous system that noise can be a friend. That's right, Rosa said. We make the world in small, lawful sounds. 6 men had come to see a fight and found a lesson instead. They stayed because lessons can be a good show when you didn't expect them. Colt Bannister lounged where lounging looks like innocence and rehearsed a pistol shot with his thumb on air. Sheriff Hart's head turned one notch and stopped there, the way a rifle turns when it hasn't decided to speak. At board 16, Rosa stopped. She stood still long enough that stillness got heavy and then lighter again. Back, she said, and stepped back 2 boards without turning. Comet followed like a river remembering a bend. She stepped forward the same 2 and then 1 more, just to show both of them the map hadn't changed. Then she led him off to dirt and rubbed the spur scar until it warmed to her palm. A sound like paper, pretending to be authority, tried the air. Zeke had come down from his window with a folded writ dangling between 2 fingers. By order of the council, he read in a voice the paper didn't like. This spectacle is to be postponed until a safety inspector from Sacramento can attest to the fitness of the bridge and the sanity of the horse. Sacramento doesn't know this horse's name, old Ben said. Hart took the paper without asking and turned it to the light. The signature was a name the valley recognized. Notary Ellis Thurber. The date was last month. The problem was that Ellis Thurber had gone to his own burial in February. Hart looked at Zeke, the way a man looks at a hole he's tired of warning people about. The dead don't sign afternoon papers, Zeke. Clerical delay, Zeke said with a shrug that tried to look like a laugh and landed on its face. Stamp travelled slow. By sunlight, Hart said, tapping the sign he'd painted. With 3 witnesses. This here fails on all counts, and the 4th, besides. He passed the paper to Mrs. Alder, who had joined Lena with a stamp in her purse and an expression like a friendly hammer. She sniffed, folded the writ in half, and tucked it into her Bible the way you store a serpent with its fangs out, carefully, for later. We'll be back at noon, Zeke said, with a rope around this nonsense. Rosa set her hand on Comet's shoulder and felt how the muscle there had learned to listen. We'll be at the mill at noon, she answered. Counting bolts. They were. By late morning, Rosa had Comet walking boards at the mouth of the bridge like a man learning to step onto a train. Forward, off, forward, pause, look, breathe, on. She left him with Tomasito and old Ben to graze the verge, and walked with Lena up the hill to the mill that had been promised to silence, and was not sure it wanted to keep the promise. The wheel was a rib cage. The sluice had the dull look of wood that hasn't been touched by human intention in a season. Swallows had delivered delicate insults in the rafters. Lena put her hand on the sill and closed her eyes as if to listen through skin. He built this with his brothers before the rush, when men wanted flour more than fever, she said. He told me once the bell's sound changes by weather. The bell knows more than most men, Rosa said, looking up. The bell rope hung fresh and clean down to Lena's hand, spliced where the rot had wanted to own it. High above, where the yoke met the headstock, a brass bolt winked in sun. Your father hid things from men who signed papers? He hid things from men who owned pens, Lena said. Mama said he believed the bell would tell the truth before a notary would. Rosa squinted at the yoke. If I were half a deed and wanted to sleep where thieves forget to look, I'd choose a bell and a barn and a Bible. We've counted 2. The mill door groaned when they pushed it. Dust stepped aside. In the corner, a handcart waited like a dog whose master had gone to sea and would be back if names meant anything. Rosa walked the floor with her boots paying attention to sound. Hollow here, honest there, a place where the water used to speak under the boards but had been told to hush by winter. Lena pointed up. There, she said, see the plug? A piece of lathe had been replaced with something smoother. Brass on wood, too careful. Rosa climbed like a person who has learned not to distrust heights, but refuses to flatter them. On the service deck beneath the belfry, she dug the heel of her hand into the too perfect patch. It gave as if it had been waiting for a polite pry. Out came a narrow brass tube capped with beeswax. It had the weight of a sin and the length of a secret. Rosa smiled without showing teeth. He was a sly man. Lena's breath wobbled and then steadied. He was a man who wanted his daughter to have a place to stand if men tried to knock the ground out. She took the tube and warmed the wax with her thumb the way you finish a letter when the post goes out. Inside, folded too many times, lay paper in her father's hand and the stamp of a county office older than Zeke Crowell's ambition. Half-deed, the surviving right. The words were patient and almost bored from having waited this long. Lena pressed the seam to her lips and then stopped herself as if afraid to make the ink taste like grief. I won't cry, she said. You can, Rosa said, but you don't have to. They didn't shout. They carried the tube down as if the mill had handed them a child and asked them to treat it like one of its own. Outside, the creek argued with Noon, and the town argued with Zeke. Colt Bannister stood with a knot of men whose faces always looked like they were about to be told a joke, and never were. Vern Lockwood had a rolled map under his arm, labelled in his pretty hand, Proposed Safety Improvements. Safety meant gates, and gates meant tolls, and tolls meant a new title for men who liked. Hart took the map and unrolled it across a barrel. "You want to add a rack above the bridge to stop logs, for safety," he read, "and a series of new levers to close the headrace in emergencies to be controlled from the trading post." He did not say what everyone could see. Close the headrace at the trading post, starve the mill at will. "It's for the town," Vern said softly, but his eyes told the truth. "For the men who own keys." Mrs. Alder's stamp thumped once on the corner of Lena's paper. "And this is for the town," she said. "Two halves make a whole. You can't just—" Zeke started. "We can," Hart said, "by sunlight with 3 witnesses." He pointed at the crowd. 1, 2, 3, and then some. Rosa saw the moment Zeke chose a different weapon. He looked at Colt and then at the river. Colt nodded and drifted upstream like a bad plan in good boots. Rosa squeezed Lena's elbow. "Watch the rack," she said. "Logs at noon tend to find excuses." The bell rang then, once, not because anyone pulled the rope, but because a gust found it and asked. It sounded like a throat cleared. People looked up without meaning to. Rosa looked down to where the current tightened around the pilings when the sun hit it sideways. She felt Comet's lead rope in her hand, even though it wasn't. "We'll walk the water," she reminded herself, and it steadied her enough to see what Colt did next. He levered a stuck log loose with a pike pole and sent a loose raft toward the bridge with a shove he could blame on the river. The current took the gift and brought it, gathering speed, pretending to be an accident all the way. "Abel!" Rosa shouted, already moving. "Wedge the east pier! Tomasito! Bell the men off the middle!" Hart ran, gun quiet in its holster because his hands were busy with rope and angles. Old Ben moved, as if he had remembered being 20, grabbing a shoreline pole and setting it against the lead log, leaning with his whole history. The first log bumped the pier with a noise that made teeth notice. The second wove sideways, kissed the wedge Abel had slammed under the rib, and stuck sulking. The third hesitated like a liar finding the room full of people who knew better. The fourth came bold, and then, seeing the contraption, decided it might be a good day to angle downstream and try something else. Up on the path, Zeke lifted his cup to his lips so no one could see his mouth swear. Vern lowered his map, so no one could see his eyes calculate a different script. Colt looked around for a face to bully and found Tomasito ringing the steeple bell with both arms like a boy, trying to pull the moon a little closer to hear. Colt took one step toward him and found Sheriff Hart already there. "Go upstream and retrieve your mistake," Hart said mildly. "You happen to be the nearest man to it. Funny how that works." Colt's smile showed its teeth the way a snare shows its wire right before you step in it. But he shouldered the pike pole and went because sometimes the easiest plan is to act like the law is your boss until you can find a chance to bite it. Downstream of the little crisis, Rosa breathed out and felt the rope that was not in her hand ease. She looked at Comet, who had watched the whole thing from the shade like a citizen. "You ready to hear the bell up close?" she asked him. He snorted and put his nose to her shoulder, the way a polite animal asks for a sentence. "Afternoon," Hart said, coming back to the barrel where Vern's map lay chastened. "I'd like to see this safety rack installed under the town's hand, not the trading posts. Mrs. Alder, can you draw a line that says so?" "I can draw 3 and stamp all of them," she said. "By sunlight." "By sunlight," the crowd answered, because sometimes a line wants friends. Late afternoon turned the creek copper and the boards of the bridge into something almost forgiving. Rosa put a leg over Comet's back, not weight, just presence, and laid herself along his spine like a roof. He shifted to accommodate her and found she didn't ask for anything but breath. She slid off and scratched the place where neck meets withers until he remembered every good scratching he had ever been given. She put her weight up again. He didn't mind. She swung a leg all the way this time and settled. "Tomorrow," she told him, last light painting the scar on his flank gold. "We ask harder." "Tomorrow," Lena said, fingers in the bell rope, eyes on the brass tube with her father's hand in it. "We file this at sunrise and read it at noon." "Tomorrow," Hart echoed, posting 2 boys by the bridge, with orders to wave hats at any log that attempted politics. Zeke went inside to write a letter that would not read well in daylight. Vern went to the livery to measure shadows for a speech about responsibility. Colt went to the saloon to translate failure into drink. Night arrived on crow's feet. The mill smelled like old pine. The town smelled like dinners that had decided to be stews. Rosa lay on the stable's threshold again and tied one bootlace to the halter, not because she feared theft, but because intention sometimes makes a sound, even when it thinks it doesn't. Tomasito snored as if proving a point about the honesty of boys who have rung bells. Somewhere near midnight, a pistol coughed in the alley behind the trading post. The horse in the nearest stall snorted awake. Rosa's hand found the rope without looking. Comet lifted his head as if someone had said his name from too far away to be polite. A second cough, then a third. Not at the bridge, not at the mill, into the air, that old frontier way men asked to be noticed without earning it. Hart's boot heels learned how to run in silence. The cough stopped because even a pistol knows when it has been caught being foolish. In the morning, the sheriff would fine Colt for firing at the moon and make him stack wood at the school in penance. For now, the town went back to breathing like a room with a door open. Dawn came dry and exact. Rosa kissed the crease of Comet's neck, thanked him for the loan of his courage, and led him to the bridge in a light that had decided to make the creek quiet for once. Board 1, 2, 3. She mounted on 4 and sat a heartbeat, then slid off and led on 5 because she was stubborn about doing things in the order nerves can respect. At board 9, she swung up again and stayed. Comet breathed out like a man choosing to be less dramatic. "Ready?" Lena said from the far bank, bell rope wrapped once around her wrist. "Ready," Hart said, hand on the new sign as if remembering who he meant to be when he painted it. "Ready," old Ben hummed, and the creek hummed back, and the bridge said nothing at all, the best kind of promise. They took board 10, 11, 12, to 13, 14, 15. At 16, Rosa's heel slid where some child's boot had sent splinters 2 summers ago, and Comet tensed in sympathy. She shifted her weight as if saying, "That happens, we do not die of it," and he believed her because he wanted to. 17, 18, 19. On 20, a trout flipped silver and wrote a curse word only fish understand. Comet flicked an ear and forgave it. They reached the last 4 boards where the bridge forgets its own courage and remembers again. Rosa felt the bell's shadow on her hair and the heat of Lena's hope. She set her hand on Comet's neck and asked for one more step, then one, then the last. He put a hoof on the bank and then another and stood on solid dirt like a man who has decided to go home, and did. "Ring it," Hart said, not loud, no need. Lena drew the rope. The bell spoke. It wasn't triumph. It was attendance. The sound said, "I am here, and so are you." It rolled down the creek and up the hill, and into the trading post and the saloon, and the school, and the places where men had left their worst plans to rot. It washed the porch where Zeke Smirked slept. Rosa dismounted with the soft dismount of women who have long practice getting off things respectfully. She put her forehead to Comet's and let her breath meet his. "Thank you," she whispered, and he didn't understand the words, but understood the tone and stored it where animals store things too big to forget. They turned, bell still breathing the last of its note, and faced the bridge again. "We'll go back slow," Rosa said, "and we will not let anyone make this a race." She stepped, and Comet stepped, and the town that had come to be told a story watched itself become part of the telling. Halfway back, a boy, too young to know how much noise weighs, whooped once at the miracle. The sound wasn't mean, it was bright. It hit the ribs of the bridge and made them sing a different key. Comet raised his head. Rosa's hands opened, low, air moving through her fingers. "We're good," she said, and made it true by staying exactly the size he needed her to be. They came off on the town side and the world did not explode. It simply widened a notch, the way worlds do when people make them behave in public. Zeke came down the steps of the trading post with a parchment that wanted to be a contract and found himself short of audience. Vern folded his map and said, "Perhaps we should propose our rack to the community board." "What board?" Zeke demanded. The one I expect will exist after noon, Vern said, and for once he wasn't lying. Rosa patted Comet and turned him toward the shade. Breakfast, she told him, which is a word even a nervous animal will learn if you say it with enough gratitude. She looked at the mill, Lena standing tall under the bell, Mrs. Alder with her stamp at the ready, Sheriff Hart writing the day down in his head before it happened, and felt the shape of the story settle into something she could lean on. By sunlight, Hart said to the air, hammering the notion into the last of the town's doubts. By sunlight, the town answered. And some of the people who answered had not meant to, and that was how you knew a habit had started to live. Rosa rubbed the spur scar one more time. We'll make a new mark over this one, she promised Comet. The kind that only shows up when the light is good. By noon, the town looked like a sentence that wanted a period. The bell's note still hung in the ribs of the bridge, soft as linen, and Sutter's Fork had the satisfaction of having been crossed without anyone lying about it. Rosa watered Comet in the shade behind the livery, while Lena Sutter carried the brass tube like it might bruise if jostled. Sheriff Hart swept the courthouse step with his boot until Dust remembered it was not allowed at a hearing. They did not do it inside. They did it on the porch, under sky, because that was the point. Mrs. Alder set the Bible down and flattened the deed halves with a palm that had stamped weddings and wills, and now found itself in love with sunlight. Old Ben leaned in the shade where seeing is better. Abel Pike stood with a hammer tucked in his belt, because sometimes law needs a nail at the exact right moment. Read, Hart said, not from a bench but from a plank, because benches are for men who forget they have legs. Lena read. Her father's hand spoke through her, unadorned, exact. The words were simple. The mill's water and wheel were to serve the town, half held by the Sutter name and half by the church as steward for the people. The brass tube had done nothing fancier than hide the plainest truth from men who preferred complicated tricks. When she finished, she looked up and did not blink. Zeke Crowell waited for a chance to cut in and found Hart's head already turned toward him. Objection, Zeke tried, and the word shrank when it crossed the sunlight. Forgery is easy, sentiment easier. Mrs. Alder lifted the torn notch Tomasito had found in the tailor's false back and married it to the rescued page. The torn arcs clicked like two teeth deciding to behave. She pressed her seal in the margin until the paper remembered who it served. Entered, she said. Vern Lockwood rolled a map over the rain barrel, proposed safety rack for log control, and aimed his voice at the part of the crowd that likes the idea of improvement more than the trouble of it. The creek carried a raft today that could have broken a child, he said. Let us be prudent and build a catch at the Narrows, for the town's good. Abel tapped the barrel head with a knuckle. And who holds the lever? Vern smiled the way bankers do when you catch them being generous in someone else's ledger. The trading post being centrally accessible. No, Hart said, and the word sounded like a door settling into hinges that have just been oiled. If we build a rack, we build it where hands without keys can reach it, and we set a bell on the beam, no closing, without 3 witnesses. The crowd liked that. People like rules that make thieves tired. Colt Bannister lounged in the doorway, thumbs hooked in his belt like he'd invented hips. He had a fresh scrape on a knuckle from an argument with a log pole and a fouler scrape on his pride from Hart's quiet fines. You going to make a committee to name the nails? He drawled. We're going to name the hands, old Ben said, so when a board holds, we can remember who set it. And Rosa tied Comet where the shade had a good opinion of horses, and came to stand between Lena and Hart, because that was where her day had put her. Zeke's eyes moved to her, as if she were a lever too. You rode him one way, he said. The wager was across and back before sundown. We crossed and returned, Rosa said. You were writing a letter to no one while it happened. A ripple of laughter took the edge off men who had been waiting to be told whether they had seen what they had seen. Zeke tried a different tack. Saddle, he said, gesturing to Vern's map as if it were evidence. The terms implied a mounted crossing in a manner customary to the territory. The terms were what you said, Hart reminded gently. Anything you forgot to say belongs to the sun, not to you. Mrs. Alder lifted her stamp. By daylight, with 3 witnesses, the wager is satisfied. The mill's status, by these halves joined, is established as the town's to steward. Applause did not break out. It arrived like a tide finding shore. Hats went back on heads. Men breathed a little easier in their chests. Women exhaled the word finally without making a ceremony of it. Rosa looked at Lena and saw the relief hit her like a warm wall and then pass, leaving a strength behind that hadn't been there at breakfast. Next, Abel said. He held up a signboard he'd planned smooth and painted quick. By sunlight only. 3 witnesses. No spurs, no whips. He handed Hart 2 nails. You want to say it, Sheriff? Hart drove the first nail and then the second with the kind of measured blows that make boys remember how a man is supposed to behave. By sunlight only, he said to the plank, to the porch, to the river, to Zeke's window glass. A low rumble upriver turned heads. It wasn't thunder. It was men with poles encouraging driftwood toward an argument. Rosa's shoulders went forward before her feet did. Abel, she said. Ben. They were already moving. Hart set his hammer down the way a man does when he means to pick it up again later and be exactly the same person. At the Narrows, 3 logs shouldered each other like men who haven't decided whether the fight began yet. Old Ben planted his pole and leaned like a tree that has decided to grow in the direction with the most need. Rosa took the upstream face and pushed with legs and back, making her breath the metronome the river could not overrule. Abel wedged a beam across the gap and shouted to Tomasito, "Rope!" The boy ran the line like he'd been born with it and tossed a coil that landed where work needed it. They turned the lead log into the slower channel and let the next 2 grind their bad temper against the cedar wedge until they forgot why they were angry. By the time the 3rd came sulking, the river had learned the new rule and obeyed without much lecture. People on the bank cheered in the quiet way of men who intend to help next time instead of watch. Vern called it luck, Zeke called it theatrics. Hart called it enough for now and told a carpenter to fetch iron straps for a proper rack before supper time. Installed at the mill, bell tied to the lever, and Mrs. Alder wrote exactly that, in a hand that would be hard to misunderstand in winter. Afternoon slid its gold along the porch rails. Lena and Mrs. Alder copied the deed twice and set 1 copy in the church strongbox, 1 in the school desk, and 1 beneath the mill's ledger with a note. If this book is missing, knock on every door until you find the person who hid it. People laughed. People also nodded. Vern tried 1 more paragraph before the day closed. Gentlefolk, stewardship is a costly habit. If the town wishes, the trading post is prepared to front the expense of the rack and the straps, to be recouped from mill revenues. A declined, Lena said, and the quickness of the word surprised her in a pleasant way. We will pass the hat and the ledger. That way we owe thanks, not interest. Mrs. Alder had already placed a pickle jar on the table with a paper label that said simply, rack. Coins sounded nicer going into a jar like that than they ever sound on a counter. Children brought buttons because children like to pay in what they have. We'll sew the sack that holds the iron, Rosa told them, and 3 girls volunteered their needles with grins that had not had enough reason lately. Near sunset, Sheriff Hart walked the new rack's first piece up the hill himself and watched Abel spike it to the posts. He tied a bell to the lever with a knot a sailor would respect. There, he said, no hands will close this without waking the town. Unless the hand is holding a knife, Vern said lightly as if joking. Then the hand will introduce itself to 20 of its neighbors before the lever moves, Hart said. We're done doing important things in the dark. Zeke Crowell did not come to admire the rack. He stayed on his porch writing a note to a friend in Placerville who liked to be owed favors. The note said, in essence, "Send me a man with a badge-shaped hole in his heart." He sealed it with wax and a color of spit no one would mistake for gratitude. Rosa took Comet down to the water after the rack was set. She let him drink and then walked him where the creek licked his fetlocks and told him what weather sounded like against bone. "This is your town too," she said. He didn't understand, but his ears liked the music of her voice when it wasn't trying to make anything happen. Lena stood with her palms on the mill's warm beam and read, out loud but softly, the names of people who would need flour first when the wheel turned again. The widow Finch, the schoolhouse, the Chinese camp below the cottonwoods, Old Man Weber if he stopped grumbling long enough to accept a sack without paying, which he would not. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Alder said, sliding the fresh copies into their boxes. 9 o'clock. We'll read the trust charter in front of the whole valley. Any man who disagrees can bring a chair. Bring 3 witnesses, Hart said, smiling just a little. Twilight taught the porch how to be blue. Lamps came on. People remembered they had beans to stir and boots to remove. Rosa rubbed the spur scar and told Comet he was the handsomest civil servant in the county. Tomasito fell asleep on the new signpost, cheek against the word sunlight, like a boy who had learned how to pick the right pillow. In the hour when conversations thin and coyotes test the edges of gardens, a smell moved through the alley, behind the trading post, that did not belong to evening. The sweet, stupid breath of kerosene. Old Ben smelled it first. He did not shout fire. He walked the alley like a man looking for his hat and saw Colt Bannister's shoulder where it should not be and a lantern where it should never be, nestled in a box of shavings behind the mill's side door. Ben took the lantern up with 2 fingers as if handling a rude insect and poured it out in the dust, which swallowed it without gossip. Then he set the empty glass down, turned to Colt, and said the kind of sentence that leaves no bruise and does more damage than a fist. That's a boy's trick. Colt's jaw did 3 small things, and none of them were thinking. "I'm just walking," Ben supplied. "Good. Walk with me to the sheriff." Hart listened without surprise. He fined Colt again in dollars he didn't have, and in work he did. 3 days stacking cordwood at the school, and 1 day clearing brush from the mill race. "By sunlight," Hart said. "With company." Colt looked at Zeke's window for rescue and found curtains. He spat in the dust and discovered no one thought spitting was a language they liked anymore. Night deepened. The rack's small bell made one test rattle in a breeze, and then learned quiet. The creek went on saying what creeks say when no one is pretending to be in charge of them. Rosa dozed with Comet's rope looped near her boot, not to hold him, but to let him tug her awake if a dream tried to get ideas. Just before dawn, a new sound threaded the dark, the clean, clicking argument of a hacksaw against iron. Abel sat up in his bed 3 streets over without knowing why, and reached for his boots. Hart's eyes opened and found the window, because sometimes law is just an ear you have trained to respect thin noises. Old Ben, who sleeps like old trees sleep, deep and ready, stood in the yard and tasted metal in the air. At the rack, a shadow hunched at the lever, saw biting the strap, breath hard with the effort of wanting things the town had told him were not his to want. The first strap gave with a sound like a stubborn word, surrendering. The bell shivered. The shadow lifted the lever a notch, and the creek's voice changed. Tomasito woke and began to run barefoot before his mind had put his name back in his mouth. He collided with Rosa at the corner. "Bell," he said, which was all the past hour needed to become the present. They came to the rack together, Rosa, Tomasito, old Ben. A moment later, Hart with his revolver in his hand and his finger not on the trigger, then Abel with a new strap and a hammer, then half the town in nightshirts. The shadow froze, and then unwound into a man Rosa did not recognize as anyone but a hired idea, a stranger with a hat that had tried to learn local weather and failed. "Put it down," Hart said. The man lifted the lever another inch instead and found 2 things at once. Ben's pole braced against the handle, and Abel's hammer kissing the saw from his hand. The lever dropped. The bell rang like a laugh that has decided not to forgive. They tied the man to the post he had come to injure, not as punishment, but as pause, until the sun could finish arriving and tell everyone what name to use in the record. Hart did not ask questions in the dark. "By daylight," he said to Rosa, as if reminding the morning of its job. She nodded, breath slowing, hand on the lever as if it were a pulse point. The creek calmed itself like a horse settling its feet. The town breathed with it. Somewhere in the trading post window, a curtain moved and stilled, the way a man does when he is counting his plans and finding them in need of repair. "Let's sit until the light names things," old Ben said, and they did, the way people do when they intend to keep a habit, together, quiet, in the open. By sunrise, the face had a name, hired out of Placerville, paid in promises and $3. He told Hart his employer liked to drink coffee on a porch and smile with only one side of his mouth. Hart wrote that down in a small book under a line that already said, "By sunlight, only hung and holding." "Trust charter at 9, Mrs. Alder reminded, tying a ribbon on her stamp. "Bring your eyes. Bring your hands," Abel added, shouldering the new strap. Rosa looked at Comet and rubbed the place where spine meets withers and said, "It wasn't a dream," as much for herself as for him. He breathed out, which is how an animal agrees when words would only get in the way. Charter morning arrived with a steadiness that made men run out of excuses. By 9, the square held benches dragged from porches, a table borrowed from the school, and 3 copies of a document that had learned to sit in sunlight, the trust of Sutter's mill. Mrs. Alder stood with her stamp like a small hammer with perfect aim. Sheriff Hart wore his good shirt and the same hat, because hats do not have good versions. Abel Pike had sawdust on his cuffs and a bell-rope burn on his palms that, "Read," Hart said in his porch voice, the one that makes people behave without reminding them they're being watched. Lena Sutter read. It wasn't a speech. It was a recipe. "This mill is held by the people of Sutter's Fork for the common good of grinding grain and turning water to work. Stewardship is vested in a board of 5, 2 chosen by the town each spring, 1 from the school, 1 from the church, and 1 from the camps upriver. All counts, collections, and inspections by sunlight only, with 3 unrelated witnesses. No person shall be weighed by insult or touched without consent." The last line made people smile in their ribs. Rosa stood at the edge, with Comet's lead on her wrist, and breathed easier like everyone else. Old Ben closed his eyes and counted to 5, which is how you mark a beginning when you don't want to waste words on it. "Names, Mrs. Alder called, and hands rose that hadn't been brave yesterday. Mrs. Rios from the laundry, Mr. Huang from the tea shop, Jonah Pike from the camps, Ruth Finch from the row of houses that get the wind first. Abel Pike, shaking his head like he hadn't meant to volunteer and was glad he had. 5. The town clapped once and let the sound sit. Zeke Crowell came late, because late looks like control if you can carry it. He had a letter from Placerville tucked in his pocket that felt like a promise of a different sheriff. He took up a place at the edge under his own porch awning, so the day would have to come to him. Vern Lockwood took a place near the table with a ledger that wanted to be called generous. "We'll begin with flour," Lena said. "First sacks to the school and the widow Finch, then the Chinese camp, who paid full price when the rest of you were hiding coin under coffee." No one argued because the bell had rung, and men who argue with bells learned to miss meals. Abel and 2 boys brought up the sluice gate, water shouldering itself into the race, with a sound like a barrel full of pennies. The wheel turned, grumbling at first like an old man who has been asked to stand, then smoother as the day climbed into its joints. When the first grain found the stones, a smell lifted that tasted like everyone's best memory of morning. Comet blew and rested the soft of his nose against Rosa's sleeve. "You earned this," she told him. "We just learned how to ask." Vern cleared his throat, the universal sign of a man about to give you something in order to receive something else. "I've drawn up an account of expenses to be anticipated," he said, unrolling paper that had beautiful handwriting and poor intentions. "Iron for the rack, timber for shoring, a modest salary for the steward's clerk." "No salaries until the winter roof stops lying about staying on," Lena said. "We can mend with buttons and thanks. Put the iron in the water and the wood in the bridge. The clerk can be a bell for now." She nodded to Thomas, who puffed up and then remembered to breathe. The bell did not wait for him. It rang on its own, one bright strike that made heads lift and eyes go to the rack. Hart was already moving. Abel was already there. The lever sat where it should. The strap wore a fresh sawtooth that had not been there at dawn. The tied man from Placerville was gone, rope cut clean. On the ground, a card lay face down. Hart flipped it. A business card from Crowell's trading post, with a flourish Zeke had paid extra for. Zeke didn't flinch. "Cards blow in wind," he said mildly. "So do rumors." "Truth doesn't," Rosa said. "They forged ahead because habits only become themselves by repetition." The first sacks came down the mill ramp, tied with cord someone's grandmother had kept in a jar, just for this purpose. Mrs. Rios cried the kind of cry that doesn't ask for attention. Mr. Huang bowed and said something in his own language that sounded like sunlight practicing. Jonah Pike took his sack and set it on a mule with hands that could be gentle or not, and had made their choice early. Around noon, clouds that had been polishing the Sierra all morning decided to come lower. The smell changed from flour and creek to sage and electricity. Hart looked at the line of hills, as if reading the script of the next hour. "We'll get rain before evening," he said. "Maybe trouble first." Trouble came down the river disguised as drift. Not the few logs a man can talk out of fighting, but a clump of timber and brush and pride that had been building itself since spring thaw and had finally remembered ambition. Upstream boys ran the bank shouting hats up. Abel waded in to push the nose of the raft toward the slower channel. Old Ben took the far pike pole and leaned like a prayer. Rosa handed Comet's lead to Tomasito. "If he gets loud, be quieter," she told the boy, and ran to the rack. Hart had his hand on the bell, not to ring it, but to hear what the iron could tell him through his palm. "Lever's stiff," he said. "Good. It should be." The raft hit wrong and tried to pivot the rack out of its honesty. The bell rang once, a warning, not a panic. Rosa put her shoulder to the beam like a woman who has moved furniture farther with less excuse. Abel wedged cedar where iron tried to be bigger than itself. Old Ben pushed and sang a low song, the one he used when colts remembered they could jump fences, and he wanted them to reconsider. People on the bank caught ropes and didn't ask who had tied them. The raft broke into smaller angers, each one adoptable. A dozen hands found a dozen problems and loved them, until they went back to being sticks. When the last branch spun past, Tomasito whooped once and then clapped his own mouth because he remembered yesterday and the bridge. Rosa laughed and let him have it. Joy belongs in a body, or it will break a window. The rain came sudden, as if the clouds had been waiting for a good excuse to let go. People ran not because they minded getting wet, but because sacks of flour mind and stew pots mind after you've put the bones in. The mill wheel drank like a giant. The creek rose to talk louder. The rack bell shook its head and decided no more arguments today. Under the trading post awning, Zeke watched Water make Washington pennies of his plans. Vern tried to look like he had always loved community. Colt tried to look like he hadn't been caught soaring. The three of them looked like a card hand nobody wanted to bet on anymore. Afternoon broke open again with light, the way Western afternoons sometimes apologize. The ground steamed. The wheels slowed to a patient chew. Children found puddles and got sermonized. The trust charter required signatures in a column that looked like a fence willing to hold. It might have settled there, a day that started as paper and ended as bread, if the smell hadn't changed a second time. Not rain now, not kerosene. Smoke, dry and mean and coming downhill with a wind that had learned to sprint. The ridge above the Chinese camp wore a grey scarf that was all motion. Hart didn't shout fire. He looked at the mill, at the race, at the ladder of ditches that old men had dug when they remembered 49, and said the sentence that made the day turn on its heel. "Open the head race full, we'll lay a ribbon of water. Flood the lower road," Vern warned, arriving as if his caution might count as contribution. "Better wet than ash," Lena said, already grabbing the sluice lever with both hands. Abel and Rosa joined her. The gate came up with a grunt and a curse, and the mill race became a small river arguing cheerfully toward the camp. Men with shovels ran to deepen the ditches. Women with buckets ran to the lines between houses. Mr. Huang began setting out basins like a man, laying place settings for the hungry. "Comet!" Rosa called, and Tomasito brought the stallion not as a weapon but as a worker. She slung a canvas hose over his back, not strapped tight, just settled like a saddlecloth, and ran beside him as he paced the ditch line, laying water where Flame expected only dry resignation. The horse didn't love the noise, didn't like the steam, didn't appreciate the black bites the fire threw when it could. He went anyway because Rosa's breath said go, and because the town had learned how to keep its noises inside. The first lick of fire reached the wet strip and turned petulant. The second smouldered and went looking for kindling and found boots and shovels and people who had already decided to be heavier than fear. Old Ben and two boys pulled brush back from a fence line with the calm of men moving furniture across the room. Hart walked the top of the ditch like a man inspecting a parade and told Embers no in a key that Embers understand. At the mill, Lena kept the head race open even when her shoulders shook, and Mrs. Alder stood behind her with the stamp, not because paperwork would help, but because habit would. Abel moved boards like chess pieces, always two ahead of where he wanted the water next. Vern fetched a second hose, perhaps by accident, and managed not to trip over his good shoes. Colt stamped sparks in a manner that suggested he had stamped worse things and knew the rhythm. When the wind shifted, Rosa shifted Comet across it, setting a new line where there was none. The stallion snorted black once and shook his mane, and Rosa rubbed the ridge of his neck, and he put his head down into work like a citizen. The fire lost interest in the idea that the town would be easy. It went uphill to look for someone lazy. It didn't find any. After an hour that counted as 10, the ridge smoked like a pipe after a sermon and then sulked. The camp stood. The houses stood. The wheel turned as if it had been asked to do something simple. The mill smelled like wet pine and accomplishment. People turned to each other with the small smiles of the newly not disastrous. Hart nodded once to Lena. "Close it to steady," he said, and she did, pulse finding the ground again through the lever. He walked to the trading post awning without hurry and looked at Zeke Crowell for a time that was respectful and not indulgent. "You'll pay the man from Placerville out of your own pocket," he said. "Then you'll apologize to Mrs. Alder for wasting her ribbon, and to Abel for making him strap iron twice." Zeke opened his mouth and found only teeth. "You can't—" "I can," Hart said, "by sunlight, with 3 witnesses. Or would you like me to read from the fines ledger you've contributed to today?" Vern half raised a hand like a boy in a class. Perhaps the trading post might contribute to the bucket fund. And to Iron, since Iron seems fond of me lately. "Put your name in the jar with the rest of us," Lena said. "No bigger. No underline." The rain came again, kinder this time, rinsing smoke out of hair and grudges out of mouths. The charter on the table went wavy at one corner and still took signatures. Mrs. Alder dried it with the hymn book and called that legal on account of God would approve. People laughed because they needed to and because it felt like tucking the day in. Toward evening, the Chinese camp sent up a pot, bigger than a washtub, full of noodles and gratitude. The school sent spoons. The saloon sent nothing but a piano tune that accidentally harmonized with the mill's creak. Rosa rubbed Comet's forelock and told him he was the handsomest fireline strider in 3 counties. He blew snot on her shirt, and she decided that counted as a compliment in his language. As lanterns bloomed, Hart walked the rack one more time and checked the strap with fingers that had learned Iron's dialect. Abel nailed a small sign at eye height. Lever rings bell. Bell calls town. He patted the board like a child's head. Old Ben sat on the mill step and watched the river tell itself to sleep. Tomasito dozed on a sack of flour with one dusty boot still on, as if ready. Zeke sent his letter to Placerville with a rider who charged extra because his horse didn't want to be associated with the errand. Vern stayed to stack bowls, which surprised everyone, including Vern. Colt disappeared and reappeared with wood for the school, as if he had misheard the fine and decided to do it twice. When the last bowl scraped the last spoon, Lena set the charter under the mill's ledger and tied both with a ribbon that used to be her mother's. "Tomorrow we grind for the road crew," she said. "If they lay new planks on the East Bridge, they eat first." "Tomorrow," Rosa echoed, rolling her shoulders into the ache that meant she had done what she had promised herself. She led Comet to the livery and let him choose which stall smelled most like triumph. He chose the one Tomasito had swept best and stood in it like a quilt had just been laid over the town. Night came without tricks. The rack's bell did not ring. The creek sang low. Somewhere on the ridge, a coyote gave its opinion and was not contradicted. Sutter's Fork slept. The mill slept. Zeke did not. He sat with an empty cup and the picture in his mind of a sheriff in a new hat riding down from Placerville to weigh people instead of paper. He smiled with the side of his mouth that still had hope and fell asleep in his chair, because even villains are villagers when the work has been done, and the rain. Morning would bring letters and answers and maybe a stranger's badge. It would also bring bread. The town had decided which mattered more and would prove it again at breakfast. The letter from Placerville arrived in a pocket that smelled like dust and haste. Sheriff Hart broke the seal in the open because envelopes behave better when they know the sky is watching. The words said the county had seen disturbances in Sutter's Fork. Irregularities with mills, bridges, and a certain animal made the subject of spectacle. An inspecting deputy would arrive to restore order. The letter did not say what kind of order. "Someone drew a badge on paper," Hart said, folding it once and then not folding it anymore. "We'll see what iron looks like attached to it." Rosa was oiling Comet's hooves with a patience that turned work into grooming and grooming into conversation. "Does the paper say we must stop being honest until it gets here?" "No," Hart said, "so we won't." By mid-morning, the new badge rode into town on a bay that didn't like its job. The man wore a hat with its ambition taller than the crown beneath it. He had a mustache that expected applause and a coat that had practiced frowning on hooks. He swung down and let the dust notice his boots. "Deputy Caleb Hollis, Placerville," he announced, tapping a star that had never stopped a fight by itself. "By authority of the county court and the good sense of men who sign things, I am here to suspend operations at Sutter's Mill, pending review. Also to impound one grey horse used in public endangerment." Comet lifted his head and sniffed in Hollis's direction like a man considering whether to waste breath. Rosa kept stroking oil along the coronet band and didn't grant the deputy the dignity of a flinch. "Impound will require a warrant," Mrs. Alder said, already opening her Bible for the pleasure of sliding a useful paper between old pages. "Served by sunlight with 3 witnesses." Hollis smiled in pieces. "Aren't we particular?" He held up a page with a red ribbon tied too tight. "Here's my order." Hart read, then held the sheet to the light so the watermark had to tell the truth. "Signed yesterday by Judge Endicott," Hart said. "Judge Endicott was on the East Road yesterday, stuck at Barton's washout till midnight." He handed the paper back with 2 fingers. "This ink was in town while the judge wasn't." Vern Lockwood cleared his throat, blinking his face toward neutrality. "Perhaps the spirit of the order, concern for safety, might guide us even if the letter traveled poorly. The spirit of the order is, somebody doesn't like losing leverage," Lena said, stepping out from the mill door with flour on her sleeve and the trust charter tied with her mother's ribbon. You may review our books by sunlight. Meanwhile, the school eats. Hollis let his gaze slide to Rosa, the way a man throws a lasso toward a moving thing and hopes it will slow. You the horse witch? I'm the woman who doesn't need your language to keep a creature from hurting himself, Rosa said. You can stand in the shade and learn, or you can walk to Placerville and return with a paper the daylight respects. A murmur backed her like a fence does without moving. Old Ben Two-Feathers tapped his pole twice on the ground. Talk! Talk! And the sound landed where nerves live. Tomasito stood with his chin high enough to be counted and his hands respectfully empty. Hollis adjusted his mustache. Very well, demonstrate your safety. If I see one hoof where it shouldn't be, I seize the animal and fine the town. You'll count out loud if you count at all, Hart said. By sunlight, with witnesses. They walked to the bridge. Hollis took up a position on the bank where he could look important without being useful. Zeke Crowell leaned in his doorway with a cup that had learned how to hide liquor under coffee. Colt Bannister appeared immaculate in a shirt that had not earned its starch. Vern hovered with a ledger open to a blank page, ready to adopt whatever sense decided to prevail. Rosa led Comet to board one and breathed. She made no speech. She tapped her knuckles twice, step, step, and the stallion put his foot where a friend had asked him to. Board 2, board 3. Hollis began to smile, the way men do when they expect the trick to be small and therefore easy to sneer at. Board 4, 5, 6. Rosa slid a palm along Comet's neck, then removed it, giving him back the choice. Board 7 hummed. Board 8 remembered itself. Board 9 offered the river's throat. Colt flicked a pebble at the planks. Hart did not turn his head. His hand moved and closed on Colt's wrist like a door deciding to be shut. Afraid of the quiet? Hart asked. Just testing the wood, Colt said, smile returning to parole. Test your manners, Hart said, and let go second, not first. At board 10, the wind lifted and dropped like a question. Rosa did not fill it with an answer. She waited until the wind decided it had asked the wrong thing, then tapped, step, and Comet agreed. Board 11, 12, 13. Hollis's boots shifted. The bay he'd ridden snorted at him for trying to look like a tree. Enough, Hollis called when they reached the middle. I see your show. Bring the animal back. It's not a show, Rosa said. It's a sentence you can live in. She brought Comet to board 14 anyway, and then 15, and then she turned him with a bend so small it felt like a thought, changing its mind without losing its dignity. They came back the way they had come, tapping, breathing, listening. She stepped onto dirt and set her palm on the grey's shoulder. There. Children clapped because sometimes you must let joy out or it will find worse doors. Hollis tried not to notice his own bay, lowering his head toward Rosa's hand, like a gossip who wants to be forgiven for being one. Rosa did not pet the deputy's horse. She did not refuse him either. She stood still and let the animal decide whether to make a friend in enemy colors. Hollis smoothed his mustache again. Mill is suspended pending inspection, he repeated louder. And I will be needing to see the trust charter. By sunlight, Mrs. Older said, already opening a ledger on the table beneath the eaves. Sit, and we'll teach you how a town reads a book out loud. Inspection took the shape Rosa liked best. Work. Abel Pike walked Hollis through the rack and bell. Lever here, strap there, no hand moves this without the town hearing it. Lena balanced sacks on the scale and made the numbers match. Mr. Huang brewed tea and did not poison it, which seemed to confuse Hollis's expectations. Old Ben showed the deputy how a pike pole makes more sense than a pistol at the Narrows. Tomasito stood on the mill porch and rang the handbell every time a man said, "By sunlight," until the phrase sounded less like a rule and more like a song the town already knew. "This is all very neighborly," Hollis said, which was the worst compliment he could think of. "But I still don't like a woman running a horse where a man should be." "You don't have to like it," Lena said. "You only have to watch it work." Zeke tried a new lever. "If the deputy finds even one irregularity, the mill closes." he announced to the men who still took their coffee at his counter because inertia can look like loyalty from far away. That's the law. It's a threat dressed in somebody else's jacket, Hart said. If the deputy finds an irregularity, we will correct it, and we will do it with the sun looking. Hollis took out a small notebook and pretended to write. One irregularity, that Gray has no brand. He belongs to himself, Rosa said. Everything in this county belongs to someone, Hollis returned. Then he belongs to the town by consent, Hart said. Stewardship, not ownership, Hollis snorted. Stewardship is what men say when they want to feel holy touching other people's tools. He closed the book. I'll make my report. He stepped off the porch and into a problem. A coil of wire lay where wire shouldn't, stretched ankle-high between two posts like a snake taking a nap. He caught it, stumbled into the barrel Vern had used to prop his map, spilled a ledger into the dust, and only just kept his dignity from losing a boot. The bay started. Comet lifted his head, and Rosa's hand moved without her thinking about what it meant to be thanked later. She were already at the bay's shoulder, breath slow, fingers low, asking nothing, giving a place for fear to go. Hart bent, collected the wire and held it up. Fresh cut, not fence scrap. Someone laying trip lines where law steps, he said. Who benefits? Accidents happen, Zeke said blandly. Not to the same men in the same alleys, old Ben said. Hollis's face did an uncertain thing, then chose embarrassment over anger. My report will note irregular placement of hazards, he said stiffly, as well as an unhealthy familiarity with barnyard animals. Be sure to spell animals right, Mrs. Alder said. That night, the deputy took a room above the saloon and tried to make the bed obey him. Below, Colt bought him a whiskey he called coffee. Zeke sent up a folded sheet with numbers shaped like arguments and an invitation to observe a failure at dawn in the livery yard. Men who like to be present when decency trips plan to be present early. Rosa slept on the threshold again, because habit keeps you company. Tomasito dozed with a curry comb under one cheek like a soldier with a bayonet. Comet rested a hind leg and dreamed perhaps of hail on a tin roof. His skin ticked with phantom flies and fell smooth again. Dawn came with a breath held. Hollis stood by the fence with his notebook open to a blank page he hoped would fill itself. Zeke leaned on the post with a smirk, trying to hire itself out to fate. Colt held something small in his palm that didn't catch the light until he wanted it to. Rosa walked in empty-handed. She made herself a shape a flight animal can stand next to. She waited until Comet blinked twice, and then asked him to take 2 steps, then 1 back, then a turn that was really just a thought happening in a circle. Perfect. Beautiful. Nothing to seize. Colt flicked his wrist. A tiny rattle of washers on a string. A baby snake, the kind men make when they want to act like nature co-signed their foolishness, skittered under the gray's belly. Comet came up. Not high, not crashing, light and sudden, like a creek discovering a new stone. Rosa stepped with him, not away. She took the rope's slack and gave it back in the same motion, the way you put a hand out for a friend who stumbled on a step and you both pretend you were dancing. There, she said. There. The second rattle hit the fence post and fell still. Hollis's bay answered with a hop and a snort that made him look at his own horse with an interest he hadn't shown since breakfast. Rosa kept the gray's ribcage breathing in time with her own. She touched the spur scar once, and Comet's head dropped because language lives in scars when you teach it gently. Done, she said, not to Hollis, but to the morning. She walked Comet out of the corner and into the yard, and asked for a sideways step that let him look at the thing that had tried to bite him. He looked, he grew bored, he blew out. Hollis closed his notebook. I've seen enough, he said, and for the first time the sentence didn't sound like a threat. Your safety works. Hart's shoulders went down a notch. I'll note that, he said. Zeke stepped off the fence and dusted a spot that didn't need it. You're going to let a town run itself. I'm going to let a town show me how it does, Hollis said. Then I'll leave before I teach it worse. His mouth tried to smile and didn't know how yet. By midday, the deputy had inspected the rack once more, watched a weighing, and eaten a bowl of stew he pretended not to enjoy. He signed Mrs. Alder's log, Deputy Caleb Hollis, observation only, and tipped his hat to the bell. "Don't ring me again if you don't have to," he said, which sounded like Faith paying a small visit. He was 3 miles down the East Road when a rider passed him in a hurry, hat low, coat higher quality trouble. Hollis turned in the saddle and watched dust go where dust likes. He did not turn back. The rider brought a packet to Zeke by way of the back door, a packet with a new set of papers and a seal Zeke liked for the way it covered ink like a hand covers a snake's head. "Order to seize the mill for arrears," the man said, "backdated to last winter, signed by a notary who enjoys meat pies." "Serve it at sundown," Zeke said, "then hand me the keys." "No sundown," a voice said, and Zeke startled because he had not realized the back door had learned to open itself for Sheriff Hart. Hart stood in the threshold with sunlight on his shoulder. "By sunlight only," he repeated, and the packet in the courier's hand seemed to get heavier. "We'll bring it at noon tomorrow," Zeke said smoothly, already calculating how to skip a day if daylight turned out to be unkind. "Bring your witnesses," Hart said. "Bring shoes that don't sink in the truth." Zeke smiled with half a mouth. "We'll bring something." They brought a flood instead. Close to dusk, a thunderhead sat down on the upper forks like a man who has decided to stay until the coffee is gone. Rain found the gullies that had missed it last time and made up for the insult. At the Narrows, drift built itself into a battering ram again and then into a plan. At the old Sutter Dam, a rotten gate that should have been mended 3 springtimes ago decided to remember resentment. The first crack took no one by surprise because Abel had been listening to wood all afternoon. The second crack got everyone to their feet. The third put a shiver in the rack bell without a hand touching the lever. "Up!" Hart said, and the town moved before the sentence had all its words. Rosa slung the hose on Comet's back, and Tomasito took the extra coil. Lena ran for the headrace lever. Mrs. Alder tucked the charter under her arm and handed her stamp to a neighbor, as if passing a child over a fence. Old Ben grabbed his pike pole and did not jog, because men who have done this before don't waste balance on showing they can move fast. At the Narrows, the raft came like a congregation with bad ideas. Abel yelled for wedges. Vern, to his credit, arrived with 2 and no speech. Colt jumped into water up to his knees and remembered he could be useful and liked it. Hart took the lever, felt the strap with his palm, and listened to bell and river and iron until they were one argument. "Hold!" he said. "Hold!" The old dam's gate let go. A brown shoulder of water rounded the bend and thought about being anger. The rack shuddered and then learned a new note, lower, more stubborn. The bell rang once, twice, not panic, but urgency. Rosa stepped to Comet's hip and set her hand where his neck turned from question to answer. "We're going to be the sound," she told him, and he believed her because she had never yet lied to a horse. They took the ditch line again, laying water where men with shovels could widen it, drawing a wet snake around the backs of houses that sat too near the creek because men like to pretend they know where water will go. A log took the rack at a mean angle. The strap squealed, the lever crawled a finger's width, the bell coughed. Abel jammed cedar into a mouth that had been about to say a bad word. Old Ben leaned his whole life on the pike pole and gave the river a better plan. Vern cursed, not in Latin for once, and shoved where it mattered. "Back it!" Hart ordered, and 5 men who had never been a team before obeyed like they'd rehearsed. The raft sheared off, sulked, and broke itself into kinder pieces against the bank where children could adopt them as forts tomorrow. The flood passed with fury and then regret. The rack held, the bell quieted. The town stood in water to the boot tops and laughed once, not because it was funny, but because breath needed a different shape than a shout. Zeke Crowell watched from his porch with a face that had run out of plans. The courier with the packet backed his horse into shadow and reconsidered his future prospects. Colt leaned on his knees and spat river, and looked like a man who might prefer being useful to being ornamental where trouble lives. By the time darkness finally made the world choose lamp over sun, the water had stopped auditioning for catastrophe and gone back to being a creek who likes attention but not lawsuits. People walked home with shovels as if they were party favors. Lena wiped flour off the headrace lever like it was sweat and laughed at herself. "Tomorrow noon," Hart said, tired in the good way, to no one and everyone. "Bring your paper. Bring your witnesses," Mrs. Alder said, retying the ribbon around the charter. "And bring your honest faces. We've seen enough of the other kind." Rosa rubbed the spur scar, the place that had learned a new language, and let Comet's breath fog her sleeve. "We'll be here," she told the dark, "by sunlight." By noon the town stood in damp boots and clear eyes. The courier with Zeke's packet tried to look like a messenger, not a fuse. Sheriff Hart set a table under the bell, laid out ledgers, the trust charter, and space for whatever noon brought. "Witnesses," Mrs. Alder called. Hands rose. "By sunlight," the crowd answered. Zeke arrived with a man in a fine coat. "Leviathan and Coburn, collections," he said, placing a sealed packet like a pistol. "Order to seize Sutter's mill for arrears." "Open it," Hart said. Out loud. Wax still smelled warm. Mrs. Alder read, then lifted the sheet to the sun, so even the watermark had to tell the truth. "Backdated," she said, "by a notary who, per the church book, was buried that week." She stamped the margin. "Contested. Entered." "Arrears against whom?" Lena asked. "The mill is a trust." "Successor obligations," the collector replied. "You. Half rests with the church for the people. The other half now the same, per my father's deed," Lena said. "You cannot seize a public trust without a county writ served by daylight. 3 witnesses." "We have a writ," Zeke said. "You have a wish," Hart answered. Deputy Hollis stepped forward. "County recognizes a local trust where fraud is not shown. Fraud is not shown. Operations meet safety pending review." Rosa stood with Comet's lead slack in her hand. "This is what daylight does to shortcuts," she told Zeke. The collector tried a last lever. "Then we attach the water." Old Ben's pole tapped the plank like a gavel. "Attach the rein while you're at it." A boy tugged Hart's sleeve, fresh saw marks at the rack strap. Abel laid his palm on iron. "Holding," he said, tightening the bolt. "Serve your paper," Hart told the collectors, "or put it away. Either way, you'll eat before you ride." The man ate stew, which ruined the tantrum he'd packed. Zeke stayed standing, Smirk finding no work. He looked to Vern. Vern surprised himself. "Stewardship suits the place," he said. "You'll regret this," Zeke told the town. "Maybe," Lena said. "We'll regret it together." Mrs. Alder raised the charter, and the jar labeled rack. "Sign what you mean. Fund what you love." Coins struck glass. Hollis set his badge on the table for a breath. "I came to shut you down," he said. "I'll write that I found a town teaching me how to leave well enough alone." Hart faced Zeke. "Keep selling beans to men who like to complain, or bring planks to the East Bridge, and let your name be a nail that holds. Choose." Zeke turned away, smaller. Rosa walked Comet under the bell. She untied her red kerchief and knotted it over the spur scar, not to hide it, but to rename it. "We don't forget," she said. "We decorate." Abel hung a placard on the rack. "Lever rings bell. Bell calls town. Town decides." The bell rang once. Clear, volunteer work. People looked up, then at one another, remembering they owned the same sky. Work resumed. Flour to the school, planks to the bridge, a spare hose to the camp. Vern carried lumber without talking. Colt stamped a last spark and joined the line. "By sunlight," Hart said. "By sunlight," the valley answered. The mill breathed. The creek agreed. And the stallion, tamed without being broken, stood where anyone could see him, and no one dared lay a hand the wrong way again. If this tale made you rethink what it means to tame something, horse or town, tell me which moment turned the tide for you. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if frontier justice and hard-won hope are your kind of stories, Hit subscribe to Gold Rush Stories and tap the bell so you don't miss the next ride.